When medals become worthless, dignity becomes priceless. Sergeant Harold Freeman stood in a sterile lobby where his scars meant nothing, where decades compressed into a dismissive sneer. Your medals are worthless here. 4 words that severed past from present, service from relevance. Then a 4-star general walked through glass doors and rendered a salute that shattered everything, a gesture acknowledging what corporate indifference could not see. In that moment, Harold understood. Some debts can never be repaid, some honors transcend paychecks, and true worth was never theirs to determine. Subscribe to witness how one salute redeemed what contempt tried to erase. The morning, Austin sunlight filtered through the chrome and glass facade of Nexus Technologies with an impersonal brilliance that seemed designed to erase shadows, to flatten everything into the same sterile present tense. Harold Freeman stood before the building's entrance, his 65-year-old frame still carrying the rigid posture of 3 decades in uniform. Though his shoulders now bore a slight forward curve that spoke of years carrying weight the world could not see, the reflection staring back at him from the polished doors showed a man whose face had been carved by wind and worry, deep lines around eyes that had witnessed things most people experienced only through screens, if at all. He adjusted his tie, a civilian garment that still felt like a costume after all these years, and felt the familiar pressure of the small metal rectangles pinned inside his jacket pocket. Medals he carried not for display, but as private talismans, reminders that he had once been essential to something larger than quarterly earnings. The building before him represented everything his generation had been told to aspire toward after service. Innovation, progress, the sleek machinery of a future where wars were fought with code instead of blood. Yet standing there, watching young professionals stream past him with their expensive coffee and wireless earbuds, Harold felt the familiar sensation of existing in 2 timelines simultaneously, one where his experience meant everything, another where it registered as nothing more than an outdated skill set. Inside, the lobby smelled of new carpet and ambition, that particular scent of spaces designed to project success rather than earn it. The receptionist, a woman perhaps 30 years younger than Harold, with hair dyed an electric violet that would have violated every regulation he'd ever known, barely glanced up from her screen as he approached. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the unconscious fluency of someone who had never known a world without instant connectivity, never understood the patience required to communicate through radio static or hand signals across hostile terrain. Harold gave his name and watched her eyes flicker with that now familiar expression, polite confusion mixed with faint pity, as she processed the idea of someone his age applying for an entry-level position. She directed him to the 3rd floor with a smile that managed to be both professionally courteous and emotionally absent, the kind of expression people wore when interacting with something they could not quite categorize, something that didn't fit the building's demographic algorithm. Harold nodded his thanks and moved toward the elevator, his gait still measured and purposeful, despite the slight hitch in his left knee from an injury sustained during his 2nd deployment, a permanent souvenir from a roadside encounter that had claimed 3 of his unit members. The elevator doors closed on his reflection once more, and he watched himself ascending through floors of open-concept offices where people half his age solved problems he didn't fully understand, contributing to an economy that had somehow decided his contributions were no longer convertible currency. The 3rd floor opened onto a space that exemplified everything modern office design aspired to be. Exposed ductwork, painted matte black, standing desks arranged in collaborative clusters, motivational phrases rendered in sans serif fonts across accent walls. Disrupt or be disrupted, read one, the imperative grammar striking Harold as oddly militaristic for people who would never receive actual orders. He was directed to a glass-walled conference room where he could see his interviewer already seated, A man perhaps 25 years his junior, wearing the uniform of the successful startup executive, dark jeans, expensive sneakers, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to suggest he was too busy innovating to worry about formal dress codes. This was Mr. Cross, the CEO, whose biography Harold had researched the night before, learning about a Harvard MBA, a previous exit that had netted him enough to self-fund this venture, a TED Talk about leveraging human capital in the digital age that Harold had watched twice, trying to decode what it actually meant. Cross looked up as Harold entered, and in that first moment of eye contact, Harold recognized something he'd seen countless times before: the immediate calculation of worth based on appearance. The subtle dismissal that happened before a single word was exchanged. It was the look of someone who had never needed to prove himself through action, who existed in spaces where potential was valued over performance, where the right vocabulary could substitute for actual achievement. Harold extended his hand and felt the brief, perfunctory shake that communicated exactly how this interview would proceed. Cross gestured to a chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to controlling rooms, and Harold sat with the automatic precision of decades spent understanding that posture communicated as much as language. The preliminary questions came in the expected sequence: background, experience, reasons for applying, and Harold answered with the straightforward honesty that had served him throughout his career, explaining that he was seeking to transition his skills in logistics and team management to the civilian sector, that he believed his experience coordinating complex operations under pressure would translate effectively to project management. He did not mention the sleepless nights calculating his depleting savings, did not speak of the strange vertigo of being suddenly unmoored from the structure that had defined his entire adult life, did not reveal that he had applied to 47 positions in the past 6 months and received 46 rejections, most of them automated responses that began with, "We appreciate your interest," before explaining why his interest was insufficient. Cross listened with the patient expression of someone waiting for relevant information to emerge, occasionally glancing at his laptop screen, where Harold's resume presumably sat alongside dozens of others from candidates who knew the correct buzzwords, who had attended the right programs, whose experience came with timestamps that matched the company's preferred demographics. The turning point came when Cross leaned back in his chair with the calculated casualness of someone preparing to deliver difficult news gently. "Mr. Freeman," he began, and Harold noted the formal address that created distance even as it pretended respect. "I can see you have an extensive background in the military." The word military carried a particular emphasis, as if it were a category requiring special consideration, something exotic or antiquated. "But I'm not sure I see how that experience translates to what we do here at Nexus. We're a fast-moving technology company. We need people who can adapt quickly to changing protocols, who understand digital frameworks, who can interface with clients in the language they speak." Each sentence landed like a small verdict, politely phrased rejections that never quite said what they meant. Harold felt something tighten in his chest, that old familiar sensation of being evaluated by metrics he could not see, judged by standards he had not been informed of in advance. He thought of his 28 years navigating military bureaucracy that made corporate hierarchies look simple, of adapting to 7 different deployment zones with their unique challenges and cultural complexities, of learning 4 languages because understanding the ground truth mattered more than assuming superiority. But he said none of this, because he recognized the futility of arguing against a decision that had already been made before he entered the room. Then Cross delivered the line that would reshape everything that followed, spoken with the casual cruelty of someone who believed he was simply stating an obvious truth. "Your medals are worthless here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Harold's chest, as if the decorations were literally visible rather than tucked away in his pocket. The words hung in the climate-controlled air with an almost physical presence, each syllable carrying the accumulated weight of every dismissal Harold had experienced since leaving the service. Every interaction where his past had been treated as a curiosity rather than a credential. Cross continued, apparently unaware of what he had just said, explaining something about cultural fit and technical requirements, but Harold had stopped listening in the traditional sense. Instead, he heard the sentence echoing through the decades of his life. Through the night, he pulled 2 wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle while under fire. Through the memorial services where he folded flags and handed them to widows. Through the quiet moments in field hospitals where he held the hands of young men and women, trying to reconcile the people they had been with the people they were becoming. Worthless. The word attached itself to every sacrifice, every loss, every moment of choosing the mission over personal safety or comfort. Harold stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, and extended his hand once more. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice carrying none of the emotion churning beneath the surface, and Cross shook it with visible relief, probably grateful the interview had concluded without awkwardness or confrontation. Unaware that he had just defined a man's entire life as currency that held no value in his gleaming office overlooking the Austin skyline. Harold descended to the lobby in the same elevator that had carried him upward 30 minutes earlier, though the journey felt somehow longer now, weighted with a different gravity. The digital display counted down floors with impersonal efficiency, 3, 2, and each number a small countdown to re-entering the world where he would need to decide what came next. How to explain this rejection to his wife Sarah, who had supported every decision with a faith that sometimes felt heavier than doubt. The elevator walls reflected his image from multiple angles, creating a fractured portrait of a man who had somehow become obsolete without changing anything essential about himself, as if the world had agreed to new rules without sending him the updated manual. He studied his reflection and tried to reconcile the person he saw with the words Cross had spoken, tried to find the worthlessness in the lines around his eyes that had come from squinting through desert glare while scanning for threats, in the set of his jaw that reflected years of making decisions where wrong choices measured themselves in body counts. The elevator chimed softly, announcing his return to ground level, to the starting point where he would need to gather himself before stepping back into the November afternoon that waited beyond the glass doors. He straightened his tie one final time, a small gesture of maintaining standards, even when those standards apparently no longer mattered to anyone but himself, and prepared to re-enter the lobby where his presence had barely registered an hour before. The space looked exactly as it had during his arrival, same violet-haired receptionist typing with the same unconscious fluency, same young professionals moving with the same purposeful urgency that characterized people convinced they were changing the world through code and market disruption. Harold moved toward the seating area near the windows, suddenly reluctant to step immediately outside. To collapse the buffer between this failure and whatever came next, he needed a moment to metabolize what had happened, to translate the experience into something he could carry home and explain without bitterness creeping into his voice. The leather chairs were positioned to offer views of downtown Austin, the skyline bristling with construction cranes and new towers, reaching toward a future that apparently had no room for people whose relevance had expired with their active duty status. Harold sat and felt his body release tension he hadn't realized he was carrying, his shoulders dropping slightly as if acknowledging defeat that his posture had been resisting. Through the window he could see traffic moving in its eternal choreography, people inside vehicles pursuing their own trajectories toward destinations he would never know, each person wrapped in private narratives that occasionally intersected but never fully merged. It occurred to him that this was perhaps the most profound difference between civilian and military life, the absolute solitude of purpose, the way everyone moved through separate orbits without the binding gravity of shared mission. His thoughts were interrupted by the lobby doors opening with a pneumatic hiss that drew his attention reflexively. An old habit from years of monitoring entry points and maintaining situational awareness. What entered changed the temperature of the space immediately. Though Harold couldn't have explained exactly how, perhaps the way the receptionist's fingers paused mid-keystroke, or the subtle straightening that occurred in several people simultaneously, or simply the presence itself that commanded attention through some invisible authority. The man who stepped through the doors wore a military dress uniform of such obvious seniority that even civilians who knew nothing of rank structure could recognize power when they saw it. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders, catching the lobby's recessed lighting and throwing small constellations across nearby walls. General Thorne moved with the contained energy of someone whose orders shaped operations across continents, whose decisions were measured in strategic outcomes rather than quarterly earnings. He was perhaps in his mid-60s, silver hair cut to regulation length, face weathered but alert, eyes that swept the lobby with the automatic threat assessment of someone who had spent decades being responsible for lives beyond counting. Harold felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. The way one veteran can identify another across crowded rooms through some invisible frequency that only those who have served can receive. Their eyes met across the lobby distance, and Harold watched something happen in the general's expression that transcended the usual acknowledgement strangers exchange in shared spaces. Thorne stopped mid-stride, his full attention suddenly focused with an intensity that made everything else in the lobby seem to fade into background noise. There was a moment of what looked like confusion, then recognition blooming across the general's features with such obvious emotion that several people stopped what they were doing to observe. The general's hand moved to his brow in a salute so crisp and precise that it seemed to reorganize the air around it, transforming the corporate lobby into something else entirely, creating a pocket of military space inside the civilian architecture. "Sergeant Freeman," Thorne said, his voice carrying across the distance with parade ground clarity, each word enunciated with a reverence that contradicted every assumption about rank and hierarchy. "It's an honor, sir." The last word hung in the air with particular weight, a 4-star general calling an enlisted man sir, and Harold felt his entire body respond to the title, to the acknowledgement it represented, rising from the chair with automatic precision despite his knees' protest, returning the salute with muscle memory that never truly faded, no matter how many years passed since active duty. The lobby had gone completely still now, every person frozen in the particular way humans stop when witnessing something they don't fully understand but recognize as significant. The receptionist's violet hair seemed suddenly garish against the gravity of the moment, her fingers suspended above her keyboard as if someone had pressed pause on her entire existence. Young professionals with their expensive coffee stood motionless, perhaps sensing that something from a different world had just manifested in their carefully designed space, something that operated according to rules their algorithms couldn't process. Thorne crossed the remaining distance between them with quick strides, and Harold found himself clasped in an embrace that military protocol would normally never permit, a 4-star general hugging an enlisted man. But protocol apparently meant nothing compared to whatever debt was being acknowledged through this physical contact. Harold could feel the general's hands gripping his shoulders with something beyond professional respect, could sense emotion running through the older man that suggested this meeting represented more than casual recognition. When Thorne pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if generals were permitted such displays, and his voice when he spoke again carried a thickness that revealed just how much this encounter meant to him. 22 years ago, Helmand Province, Thorn said, and Harold felt the words reaching back through time to retrieve memories he had carefully archived in the parts of his mind, reserved for experiences too intense to examine regularly. You pulled me out of that vehicle after the IED hit. You and Corporal Martinez, God rest him, got me and my driver out while the ammunition was cooking off. The words, painted scenes Harold could never entirely forget, the particular smell of burning metal and diesel, the way Martinez had screamed for him to move faster while flames licked up through the vehicle's floor, the weight of a wounded captain. Thorn had been a captain then, just another officer among thousands, as Harold dragged him across sand that seemed to extend forever while bullets kicked up small geysers around them. He remembered the way Thorn's leg had been twisted at an angle that made Harold's stomach clench, remembered the captain's face contorted with pain, but his voice still trying to issue orders, still trying to maintain command even while being rescued. Harold had done what needed doing because that was the training, the instinct, the fundamental understanding that you didn't leave people behind regardless of rank or personal risk. Martinez had died 3 months later in a completely different engagement, his name now carved into black granite in Washington, alongside thousands of others who had transformed from people into memories, into names, into statistics that civilians heard and forgot before finishing their morning coffee. You saved my life, Thorn continued, his grip on Harold's shoulders tightening as if afraid the man might disappear if not physically anchored. I tried to find you afterward, to properly thank you, but you'd been reassigned and then, well, the years get away from us, don't they? There was genuine regret in the general's voice, a recognition that gratitude delayed might as well have been gratitude denied, that some debts accrued interest that could never be repaid. Harold managed to find his voice, though it came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by emotions he'd been suppressing since Cross had declared his medals worthless. Just doing my job, sir, he said, and the words sounded inadequate even to his own ears, a massive understatement of a moment that had defined not just Thorn's survival, but Harold's understanding of his own capacity for action under impossible circumstances. The general shook his head firmly, rejecting the minimization. No, he said with the absolute authority of someone accustomed to having the final word on all matters. What you did went far beyond duty. You could have stayed in cover. Most people would have. You chose differently, and I've spent 22 years living because of that choice. The lobby remained suspended in its strange stillness. Every person there inadvertently witnessing a debt being acknowledged, honor being recognized in a way their modern world rarely permitted or understood. A moment that belonged to a different value system entirely. The sound of footsteps on the marble stairs drew both men's attention, pulling them slightly out of the private moment they had created within the public space. Mr. Cross descended from the 3rd floor with a young woman Harold didn't recognize. Both of them engaged in the kind of animated conversation that suggested important business being conducted in casual tones, the performance of informality that somehow reinforced rather than diminished hierarchy. Cross was mid-sentence about market projections when he noticed the scene in the lobby, his words trailing off as his brain processed the incongruous image of a 4-star general standing in his headquarters, appearing to be in deep emotional conversation with the old veteran he'd dismissed less than an hour ago. Harold watched Cross's expression shift through several stages, confusion giving way to recognition, giving way to a kind of calculation that suggested he was rapidly reassessing the situation and its implications. The CEO's body language changed immediately, straightening into something that approximated respect while retaining the underlying confidence of someone on home territory. Someone who controlled the space regardless of who entered it. Cross adjusted his course to intercept them, his professional smile deploying with practiced ease, and Harold felt a complicated surge of emotions. Vindication mixed with something darker. A grim satisfaction that the universe was about to deliver a lesson about worth that couldn't be taught through PowerPoint presentations or quarterly reviews. "General Thorne," Cross said, extending his hand with the enthusiasm of someone greeting an unexpected opportunity. "This is an unexpected pleasure. I'm Marcus Cross, CEO of Nexus Technologies. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow to discuss the contract proposal." His voice carried the particular pitch of someone switching into sales mode, and Harold could see him already recalibrating his approach to incorporate this new variable. The connection between a potential client and the man he'd just rejected. Thorne shook the offered hand with professional courtesy, but Harold noticed the general's posture remained slightly angled toward him, maintaining their connection even while acknowledging Cross's presence. "Yes, the logistics software integration for the European bases," Thorne confirmed, his tone neutral in the way military officers learn to keep their cards hidden until deciding what game they were playing. "I arrived a day early to tour Austin. My aide is handling the hotel arrangements." Cross nodded enthusiastically, gesturing vaguely toward the floors above, as if the building itself was evidence of Nexus's qualifications. "We're very excited about the potential partnership. The military sector represents a significant growth opportunity for us, and we believe our platforms can revolutionize how you handle supply chain management." The words flowed with rehearsed smoothness, and Harold recognized the pitch structure, establishing mutual benefit, suggesting transformation, positioning the company as solution rather than vendor. But Thorne's attention kept returning to Harold, and Cross finally acknowledged the elephant in the lobby by gesturing between them with forced casualness. "I see you've met Mr. Freeman," he said, and Harold detected the slight emphasis on the civilian honorific rather than military rank, the subtle attempt to reframe the relationship into something less significant. "He was here for an interview earlier. Small world." The phrase attempted to domesticate the coincidence, to render it manageable and unremarkable. But Thorne's expression suggested he was receiving very different information from the scene than Cross intended to transmit. The general turned fully toward the CEO now, and Harold recognized the shift in his bearing, the subtle hardening that occurred when military officers stopped being diplomatic and started being direct. "An interview?" Thorne repeated, his voice carrying a new edge that made the receptionist across the lobby suddenly become very focused on her computer screen. "What sort of interview?" Cross seemed to sense the temperature change but misread its direction, smiling with the confidence of someone about to explain a reasonable business decision. "Entry-level project management position. Unfortunately, we didn't feel Mr. Freeman's background was the right fit for our current needs. His experience is primarily military, and we operate in a very different environment here." The words landed in the space between them like small explosives, each one detonating with implications Cross seemed completely unaware of. Harold watched Thorne's jaw tighten, saw the general's eyes narrow in the particular way officers did when processing information that confirmed their worst suspicions about civilian leadership. "I see," Thorne said, and the two words contained volumes of judgment. "And how exactly did you determine that Sergeant Freeman's background wasn't suitable?" The question appeared casual, but Harold recognized it as anything but. This was a senior officer beginning an investigation, establishing facts before rendering conclusions. Cross shifted slightly, apparently starting to recognize that this conversation wasn't following the script he'd anticipated. "Well, General, I'm sure you understand that corporate environments have different requirements than military contexts. We need people who can move fast, adapt to changing technologies, interface with clients using contemporary business language. Someone with Mr. Freeman's extensive experience might find it challenging to integrate into our culture. Each euphemism was a small evasion, a way of saying too old without using those exact words, of suggesting obsolescence without making it legally actionable. Harold felt a strange detachment watching Cross explain away his worthlessness in real time, as if observing from outside his own body, while this young man in expensive sneakers justified why 3 decades of service didn't qualify him to organize software project timelines. Thorne let the silence extend after Cross finished speaking, a technique Harold had seen officers use when they wanted their subordinates to fully commit to a position before revealing why that position was catastrophically wrong. The general's face had gone carefully neutral, the kind of expressionlessness that veterans learned to recognize as the calm before consequences. "Mr. Cross," Thorne finally said, his voice dropping into a register that suggested he was no longer speaking as a potential client, but as someone rendering judgment. "Let me make sure I understand your assessment. This man," he gestured toward Harold, who served 28 years in uniform, who coordinated logistics operations in 7 combat zones, who managed supply chains under conditions where failure meant soldiers didn't eat or ammunition didn't arrive, who led teams through circumstances where mistakes measured themselves in casualties rather than missed deadlines, who demonstrated the kind of adaptability that kept people alive in constantly evolving threat environments. You've determined he lacks the qualifications to organize your software projects." The question was structured to permit only one answer, but Cross apparently hadn't spent enough time around senior military officers to recognize when he was being given rope to hang himself. "With respect, General, military experience and corporate experience are fundamentally different things," Cross said, his confidence wavering but not yet broken. "I have to make decisions based on what's best for Nexus Technologies, and I didn't feel—" "Your medals are worthless here," Thorne interrupted, his voice cutting across Cross's explanation with the precision of someone who had just located the exact point of failure. "That's what you told him, wasn't it?" Harold felt the entire lobby seem to contract around those 5 words, every person present suddenly aware they were witnessing something that transcended a simple business conversation. Cross's face went through several colors in rapid succession: confusion, then recognition, then the pale realization that he had made a mistake whose dimensions were only now becoming clear. That is what I meant was—" Cross started, but whatever explanation he had begun assembling collapsed under the weight of Thorne's gaze. The general took a step closer, and though he was not physically imposing or threatening, there was something in his presence that made Cross instinctively step backward. "Let me tell you about worthless medals, Mr. Cross," Thorne said, his voice quiet now, but carrying through the lobby with absolute clarity. "That man saved my life 22 years ago when he had every reason to stay in cover and protect himself. He dragged me and my driver out of a burning vehicle while ammunition was exploding around us. One of the men who helped him, Corporal Martinez, died 3 months later serving the same country you're currently free to build your company in because people like Sergeant Freeman chose to put themselves between threats and civilians who would never know their names." The general paused, letting his words settle, and Harold could see Cross's expression transforming from defensive confidence into something approaching horror as he began to understand exactly what he had done and who was now holding him accountable for it. Thorne wasn't finished. "Those medals you dismissed represent sacrifice you cannot begin to comprehend. They're awarded for valor under fire, for leadership in impossible circumstances, for dedication that asks everything and guarantees nothing except the opportunity to serve. And you, the pronoun landed with particular weight, sitting in your climate-controlled office, having never risked anything more significant than venture capital, having never led anyone through anything more challenging than a product launch, having never made a decision where the wrong choice meant people didn't come home. You decided those medals, those experiences, that character was worthless because it didn't fit your corporate culture. Each sentence was delivered with prosecutorial precision, building a case that required no formal verdict because the judgment was already obvious to everyone present. Harold watched Cross deflate in real time, all his CEO confidence bleeding away as he confronted someone who operated in a completely different hierarchy of value. Someone whose authority derived from something far more substantial than business success or educational credentials, or the ability to raise funding rounds. The young woman who had descended the stairs with Cross remained frozen several steps above the confrontation, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield, as she watched her boss face consequences she had probably never imagined possible in their carefully controlled corporate environment. Other employees had begun to gather at the periphery, drawn by the unmistakable tension that radiated from the lobby's center, and Harold could see them exchanging glances that suggested they were witnessing something that would be discussed in whispers long after it concluded. Thorne shifted his attention from Cross to the broader space, seeming to notice for the first time that their conversation had acquired an audience. But rather than moderating his approach, the general appeared to decide that the presence of witnesses required him to be even more explicit about the principles at stake. He turned back to Cross with the deliberate movement of someone ensuring everyone present would see and hear what came next. "I came here prepared to award Nexus Technologies a contract worth approximately $38 million over 5 years, Thorne said, and Harold watched Cross's eyes widen at the specific figure, at the magnitude of what hung in the balance. The contract would have established your company as the primary logistics software provider for NATO installations across Europe. It would have been, I imagine, the largest single deal in your company's history. The past tense of would have been hung in the air with obvious implication, but Thorne articulated it anyway, ensuring there was no ambiguity about what was happening. "That contract is now cancelled," he stated, with the finality of someone whose decisions were rarely questioned and never reversed. "I don't do business with people who disrespect heroes." The words echoed through the lobby with devastating simplicity, stripping away all the complexity of corporate relationships and military procurement processes to reveal a fundamental principle: that some lines, once crossed, eliminated all possibility of future partnership regardless of technical qualifications or competitive pricing. Cross's face had gone beyond pale into a kind of greyish tone that suggested his brain was struggling to process multiple catastrophes simultaneously. "General Thorne, please, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice taking on a desperate quality that contrasted sharply with the confident authority he'd displayed an hour earlier. "What I said to Mr. Freeman was taken out of context. I didn't mean to suggest that military service wasn't valuable, only that—" But Thorne raised a hand, cutting off the explanation with a gesture that communicated he had no interest in hearing justifications or contextualizations. "There is no context that makes those words acceptable," the general said flatly. "You told a decorated combat veteran that his service was worthless. That's not a statement that requires interpretation or clarification." Harold stood watching this exchange with a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't entirely untangle. Vindication, certainly, but also something like sadness for how completely Cross was being dismantled in front of his employees. And beneath that, a deeper weariness about how this confrontation shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. He thought about Sarah waiting at home for news of the interview, about how he would describe this scene to her. about whether this public validation would feel like triumph or just another exhausting confirmation that his worth only registered when someone with sufficient authority chose to acknowledge it. Thorne glanced at him then, as if sensing Harold's emotional complexity, and the general's expression softened slightly before returning his attention to Cross. "Mr. Freeman never asked for my intervention," Thorne said. "I suspect he was prepared to walk out of here with his dignity intact, regardless of what I did or didn't do. But I'm not willing to reward your disrespect with military contracts and the prestige that comes with them. You'll have to build your company with clients who share your values, rather than with an institution that holds different ones." The statement drew a clear line between military culture and whatever Cross represented, suggesting that some divides couldn't be bridged through mutual business interests when fundamental respect was absent. Cross made one more attempt, his voice now openly pleading in a way that would probably humiliate him more than anything else once he had time to reflect on this scene. "General, Nexus Technologies has invested 18 months developing this proposal. We've customized our entire platform around the specifications your procurement team provided. This cancellation would it would devastate us." The admission of vulnerability was almost painful to witness, and Harold felt an unexpected flash of something like pity for this young man who had built his success on confidence and was now discovering that confidence without wisdom was just sophisticated fragility. But Thorne remained unmoved, his expression suggesting he had witnessed far too much genuine devastation to be particularly concerned with the software company's financial projections. "Then perhaps this will be an educational experience for you," the general said, not unkindly, but without yielding an inch. "Perhaps you'll learn that how you treat people when you believe they can't help you reveals more about your character than any business proposal ever could. Perhaps you'll understand that the true measure of leadership isn't how successfully you court clients, but how much respect you show those who have no leverage over you whatsoever." The lobby had achieved that particular quality of silence that emerges when people are desperate to disappear, but too captivated by unfolding drama to actually leave. The receptionist had given up any pretense of working, her violet hair bent toward the scene with obvious fascination. Several employees had phones out, possibly recording, or possibly just holding them as security objects while they processed what they were witnessing. Harold noticed one older man, perhaps in his 50s, wearing a maintenance uniform, watching from near the elevators with an expression that suggested deep personal satisfaction, as if he too had experienced dismissals based on age and found vicarious justice in Cross's public humbling. The general turned his full attention back to Harold, and his face transformed from the stern judgment he'd directed at Cross into something warmer, more human, more openly emotional than military bearing typically permitted in public settings. "Sergeant Freeman," he said formally, using rank as a mark of respect and remembrance, "I apologize that your service has been treated with such casual disregard. That's a failure of our culture, not a reflection of your worth." The words carried the weight of someone speaking not just personally, but representationally, acknowledging a broader societal debt that went beyond this single incident. Harold found his voice finally, though it came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the emotional whiplash of the past 2 hours. "Thank you, sir," he managed, and the 2 words felt inadequate for the moment, but also perfectly sufficient, because they both understood that some expressions of gratitude couldn't be elaborated without diminishing their essential truth. Thorne reached into his uniform jacket and produced a business card, extending it with both hands in a gesture that suggested he was offering something more significant than mere contact information. "My personal number is on here," he said. "I want you to call me tomorrow. I have some people I'd like you to meet. Military contractors, logistics coordinators, People who actually understand what your experience is worth. If you're looking for work, I can promise you won't face this kind of ignorance again." The offer hung between them, not as charity, but as a form of restitution, an attempt to correct an imbalance that went far beyond Harold's individual situation. Harold took the card carefully, feeling its weight as something more than paper and ink, a tangible connection to possibility that hadn't existed 2 hours ago. "I'll call," he promised, and Thorne nodded with satisfaction before delivering one final statement that seemed aimed simultaneously at Harold and the broader audience that surrounded them. "Remember something, Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice carrying across the lobby with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard over battlefield noise and bureaucratic resistance. "Your worth was never theirs to determine. It existed before you walked into this building, and it will exist long after this company becomes another forgotten name in the tech industry graveyard. Men like you built the foundation that allows men like him," he gestured toward Cross without looking at him, "to play at business without ever understanding what real stakes look like, what real leadership requires, what real sacrifice means." The word settled over Harold like a benediction, a formal acknowledgement of something he had known intellectually, but needed to hear spoken aloud by someone whose authority derived from the same crucible that had forged his own character. Thorne extended his hand one final time, and Harold shook it with the firm grip that military culture taught, not crushing, not weak, but solid and certain, communicating presence and commitment through physical contact. Then the general stepped back, rendered one more crisp salute that Harold returned with equal precision, and the two men acknowledged each other across a gulf of rank that somehow didn't matter compared to the shared understanding of what service meant, what it cost, what it required of those who chose it over easier paths. Thorne turned and walked toward the exit with the purposeful stride of someone who had said everything that needed saying and saw no reason to linger in spaces that had revealed their true character. The automatic doors hissed open to receive him, and November sunlight flooded briefly into the lobby before the doors closed again, sealing the climate-controlled environment back into its artificial perfection. In his wake, the general left a silence that felt different from the one that had preceded his arrival, this one charged with implications and realizations, with the uncomfortable recognition that everyone present had just witnessed their workplace culture being judged and found wanting by standards they hadn't known they were supposed to meet. Harold remained standing in the center of the lobby, still holding the business card that felt warm from the general's hand, aware that every eye in the space was now focused on him, with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect to something that might have been shame. Cross stood several feet away, his expensive sneakers rooted to the marble floor, his face still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred, the deal that had evaporated, the public rebuke that would follow him through industry circles, the knowledge that his words to one seemingly powerless applicant had cost him everything he'd been working toward for 18 months. The young woman on the stairs finally moved, descending the remaining steps with visible hesitation, approaching Cross with the careful movements of someone navigating around an unexploded device. "Marcus," she said quietly, using his first name in a way that suggested either intimacy or desperation. "We should probably call the legal team and PR. This is going to... People are recording." Her voice trailed off, unable to articulate the full dimensions of the crisis they were facing, and Harold realized that in her world this constituted a genuine emergency. Reputation damage, contract loss, social media exposure, all the modern catastrophes that measured themselves in metrics he barely understood. Cross nodded numbly, seeming unable to formulate words or concrete plans, his entire posture suggesting a man who had built his identity around being the smartest person in any room, and was now confronting evidence that intelligence without wisdom was just computation without meaning. Harold watched him for a moment longer, feeling that complicated mixture of vindication and pity intensify, recognizing that Cross would probably learn something from this experience, would probably change in some fashion, but that whatever growth occurred would come at a cost far higher than if he had simply chosen respect as a default setting instead of something to be earned through demonstrated utility. Harold turned toward the exit, his body making the decision before his conscious mind had fully processed that it was time to leave this place and whatever it represented. As he moved across the lobby, something unexpected happened. The older maintenance worker he'd noticed earlier stepped forward, positioning himself in Harold's path, but with body language that communicated solidarity rather than obstruction. "Thank you for your service, sir," the man said, his voice carrying the particular gravity of someone who understood what those words actually meant, rather than using them as reflexive politeness. He extended his hand, and Harold shook it, noticing the weathered quality of the man's palm, the calluses that spoke of decades working with tools and physical labor, the kind of hands that built and fixed things while other people theorized and strategized in conference rooms above. "Vietnam, 68 to 70, the man added quietly, and suddenly the connection between them deepened beyond the formal exchange of gratitude, becoming recognition between people who had served in different wars but shared the fundamental experience of subordinating personal safety to something larger. "Welcome home," Harold said, using the phrase that veterans offered each other across decades and conflicts, the acknowledgement that coming back was its own challenge, separate from the deployment itself. The maintenance worker nodded, his eyes bright with emotion that suggested he didn't often encounter this kind of recognition in his daily work, moving through the building, maintaining systems while remaining invisible to most employees. "These kids," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the space around them, "they don't understand. They think disruption means something. They think innovation matters more than character. But they're building castles on sand, every one of them, and they don't even know it." His words carried the weight of someone who had watched empires rise and fall, who had outlived the certainty of youth and arrived at the harder wisdom of age. Harold felt the truth of it resonate through him, not bitter exactly, but clear-eyed about the gulf between what the world claimed to value and what actually sustained civilization when the surface performance cracked to reveal what lay beneath. They stood together for a moment longer, two veterans separated by a generation but united by something deeper than chronology, before the older man stepped back with a final nod and returned to whatever task he'd been engaged in before the confrontation erupted. Harold continued toward the doors, aware that several other people had moved slightly closer, as if wanting to speak to him, but uncertain whether they had earned the right to breach that distance. One young man, perhaps 30, wearing the standard uniform of startup culture, did step forward as Harold reached the exit, his face flushed with something that looked like embarrassment or possibly courage mustered for an uncomfortable admission. "Sir," he said, the honorific coming out awkwardly as if he wasn't accustomed to using it, "I just wanted to say..." What happened here was wrong. Not everyone at Nexus shares Marcus's views. The statement hung between them, and Harold evaluated it for sincerity, trying to determine whether this was genuine regret or simply damage control, someone trying to separate himself from his boss's disgrace before it contaminated everyone by association. He decided it didn't ultimately matter. The young man had chosen to speak when remaining silent would have been easier, and that counted for something regardless of underlying motivation. "I appreciate that," Harold said simply, not because the words particularly moved him, but because acknowledging the gesture seemed like the gracious thing to do, the kind of response that closed conversations without creating new wounds. The young man nodded, looking relieved to have delivered his message, and stepped back to allow Harold passage. The automatic doors opened before him like a portal between worlds, and Harold stepped through into the November afternoon that had been waiting patiently for his return. The air outside felt different than it had when he'd entered 2 hours earlier, cooler somehow, or perhaps just more honest, no longer filtered through HVAC systems and corporate aesthetics. The Austin sun hung lower in the sky now, approaching the angle where it would transform the city into golden hour perfection. That brief window when everything looked simultaneously more beautiful and more melancholy than normal circumstances permitted. Harold stood on the sidewalk outside Nexus Technologies and let himself feel the full weight of what had just occurred, no longer maintaining the controlled exterior that had carried him through the confrontation. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline finally releasing now that the crisis had passed, and he noticed his reflection in the building's glass facade, the same man who had stood there earlier, but somehow fundamentally altered by the past hours. He pulled out his phone to call Sarah to tell her what had happened before trying to make sense of it himself, but paused with his thumb hovering over her contact. How did you explain that your worth had been publicly declared worthless and then immediately reclaimed by someone whose authority made the initial judgment irrelevant? How did you convey the emotional violence of dismissal, followed by the equally intense experience of vindication? How did you describe feeling simultaneously validated and exhausted, triumphant and hollowed out? Harold pocketed the phone again, deciding the conversation required physical presence rather than disembodied voices carried through cellular networks. He would drive home, would walk through their front door, would sit across from Sarah at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten breakfast, while he'd nervously adjusted his tie, and she'd assured him the interview would go well, and would try to translate this experience into language that captured its essential truth without drowning in the emotional complexity. He looked down at the business card still clutched in his hand, at General Thorne's name, embossed in formal script above contact information that represented possibility, opportunity, the promise that his experience might still have currency in circles that understood its value. The card felt heavier than its physical composition warranted, weighted with implications about second chances and unexpected interventions, about how sometimes the universe corrected its own injustices through coincidences that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Harold carefully placed it in his wallet, nestling it behind his driver's license, where it would remain protected and accessible. A tangible reminder that his medals, whether physical objects in his pocket or intangible qualities in his character, had worth that existed independent of any single person's ability to recognize it. He turned away from Nexus Technologies and began walking toward the parking garage where his truck waited, each step carrying him further from what had happened and closer to whatever came next. The parking garage's concrete levels seemed to compress around Harold as he ascended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the utilitarian space that existed in stark contrast to the lobby's designed perfection. This was architecture that didn't pretend to be anything except functional: raw concrete, exposed rebar, oil stains marking spaces where vehicles had leaked their vital fluids, while their owners conducted business in the towers above. Harold found his truck exactly where he'd left it 2 hours earlier, a 15-year-old Ford that had outlasted 2 deployments worth of payments and now ran on stubbornness and regular maintenance. The kind of vehicle that younger drivers might dismiss as outdated, but that mechanics respected for its basic engineering and absence of unnecessary complexity. He unlocked it manually, the key turning in the door with mechanical certainty that didn't require wireless signals or touchscreens. and climbed into the cab that still smelled faintly of the pine air freshener Sarah had hung from the rearview mirror before his last job interview 3 weeks ago. The familiarity of the space, worn bench seat that had molded to his form, steering wheel wrapped in tape where the original leather had cracked, dashboard with its simple analog gauges, provided a kind of comfort that the modern world's sleek surfaces couldn't replicate, a reminder that not everything needed constant upgrading to maintain its value. Harold started the engine and listened to it turn over with the reliable sound of machinery that had been properly maintained, that had oil changed on schedule and parts replaced before they failed catastrophically. He sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the concrete wall ahead while his mind continued processing what had occurred. The narrative his brain wanted to construct was simple: villain rebuked, hero vindicated, justice served through unlikely intervention, but the reality felt more complicated, more ambiguous in its emotional aftermath. Yes, Cross had been publicly humiliated for his disrespect, but Harold took no particular pleasure in watching someone be dismantled even when they deserved it. Yes, Thorne had validated his worth in terms that couldn't be argued with. But the validation had come from external authority rather than from any intrinsic change in how the civilian world assessed his qualifications. The contract cancellation felt less like justice and more like an accident of timing. If Thorne hadn't arrived when he did, Harold would have walked out of that building carrying the same worthlessness Cross had assigned him. And the CEO would have proceeded with his lucrative partnership, never understanding what he had failed to recognize in the lobby. The thought was sobering rather than satisfying, a reminder that vindication shouldn't require the coincidental presence of 4-star generals to mean anything. He put the truck in reverse and began navigating the parking garage's descending spiral, the concrete walls sliding past his windows in repetitive patterns that created a kind of hypnotic effect. His mind drifted to Martinez, Corporal Eduardo Martinez, who had been 23 when he died, and would remain 23 forever in Harold's memory, frozen at that age, while Harold continued accumulating years and experiences that Martinez would never have. They had pulled Thorne from that vehicle together, working with the unconscious coordination that develops between soldiers who trust each other completely, each knowing what the other would do before conscious thought translated into action. Martinez had taken point covering them while Harold dragged the wounded captain across open ground, his rifle firing controlled bursts that forced enemy shooters to keep their heads down rather than maintain sustained fire. 3 months later, Martinez had been killed by a sniper in a completely different province, shot through the neck while providing security for a medical convoy, dying before the medics could do anything except hold his hand and tell him he'd done good, that he'd saved the convoy, that his death meant something. Harold had received the news while on patrol himself, had continued moving through the mission because that's what you did, had waited until returning to base before allowing himself 15 minutes in the latrine to punch the wall until his knuckles bled, and then compose himself enough to write the letter to Martinez's mother that the army would forward along with the folded flag and the posthumous medal. The parking garage's exit deposited him onto a downtown Austin street alive with late afternoon traffic, vehicles moving in the eternal dance of commuters and delivery drivers, and rideshare services navigating between destinations that existed independent of each other, except in their shared need for road space. Harold merged into the flow and let himself be carried along, not particularly focused on optimizing his route, but simply following familiar patterns toward the interstate that would take him back to the modest subdivision where he and Sarah had bought their house during his final assignment at Fort Hood. The city moved past his windows in fragments, glass towers reflecting clouds and other glass towers in infinite regression, construction sites where new buildings were perpetually rising to accommodate Austin's explosive growth, homeless encampments tucked under overpasses where people who had been left behind by that same growth tried to survive in the margins. The contrast always struck Harold as particularly American, immense wealth and innovation happening simultaneously with immense suffering and neglect, both existing in the same geographical space, but operating in completely separate realities that rarely intersected except when the successful needed to step around the unsuccessful on their way to air-conditioned vehicles. He thought about Cross's comment regarding cultural fit, about how experience needed to translate into contemporary language, and recognized it as fundamentally a statement about willingness to ignore certain truths in favor of maintaining comfortable narratives. Traffic slowed near the interstate entrance, brake lights creating a river of red that flowed backward through the stopped vehicles. Harold shifted into neutral and let the truck idle while the line crept forward, using the pause to finally pull out his phone and text Sarah a brief message that he was heading home and they needed to talk. Her response came back almost immediately. 3 words that carried both concern and support. "I'm here waiting." The simplicity of it, the absolute reliability of her presence regardless of what news he brought home, made something loosen in Harold's chest that had been tight since Cross had pronounced his medals worthless. 31 years of marriage had taught them both how to communicate through shorthand and implication, how to trust that the full story would emerge when they had physical presence and time rather than trying to compress complex emotional experiences into text messages that would be misread or incomplete. Sarah had been with him through every deployment, every return, every struggle to reintegrate into civilian life after months or years, operating under completely different rules and expectations. She had learned military culture by osmosis, had become fluent in its peculiar combination of formality and profanity, had developed the particular resilience required of those who stayed home and maintained normal life while their partners disappeared into classified operations and returned changed in ways they couldn't always articulate. The traffic finally broke free and Harold accelerated onto the interstate, feeling the truck settle into its preferred cruising speed, where the engine ran most efficiently and the road noise reached a steady pitch that made thinking easier. The city began giving way to suburbs and then to the transition zone between Austin's urban core and the surrounding landscape that hadn't yet been consumed by development. Strip malls appeared and disappeared, each one virtually identical in its configuration of chain restaurants and big box stores, the kind of commercial spaces that could exist anywhere in America without particular attachment to local geography or culture. Harold had always found something both comforting and depressing about this landscape. Comforting because it meant you could navigate any American city using the same visual vocabulary. Depressing because it suggested that genuine distinctiveness had been sacrificed to the efficiency of replication. He thought about Nexus Technologies and its aspirations to revolutionize military logistics, about how Cross's company was probably no different from dozens of others pursuing the same contracts with the same promises, each one convinced they were innovative, when they were really just iterating on existing concepts with slightly different user interfaces. The thought made him smile without humor. The military had been coordinating complex operations long before software startups decided to disrupt the sector, and while technology certainly helped, the fundamental challenges remained unchanged. Moving the right equipment to the right place at the right time, despite conditions that actively resisted organization. His exit approached, and Harold signaled even though traffic was light, following protocols that had become automatic through decades of conscious practice. The off-ramp curved down toward the surface streets of his neighborhood, and he felt the familiar transition from highway anonymity to local specificity, from being one vehicle among thousands to being Harold Freeman returning to the house at 2847 Pinewood Drive, where Sarah would be watching for his truck through the front window. He turned onto their street and saw the modest ranch houses that populated the subdivision, each one similar enough to indicate they'd been built by the same developer using a limited set of floor plans, but individualized through the accumulated choices of their inhabitants. Different paint colors, various landscaping approaches, the gradual divergence that occurred when people imposed their personalities on standardized architecture. His own house appeared ahead on the right. Distinguished by the American flag, Sarah kept flying from the porch bracket, a gesture that had started as simple patriotism but had evolved into something more complicated after Harold's retirement, becoming simultaneously a statement of pride and a kind of protective talisman, a visible reminder to their neighbors that veterans lived here, that service had been rendered, that respect was expected even if not always received. Harold pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, sitting for a moment in the sudden silence while gathering himself for the conversation ahead. Sarah stood in the doorway as Harold climbed down from the truck, lit by the dulling November light and the warm house glow behind her. She wore the University of Texas sweatshirt he had given her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that signaled days spent organizing and tending a household that never stopped making demands. At 63, she carried the quiet, practiced steadiness of someone who had learned adaptation as a way of life, who had held families together through deployments and absences and the small catastrophes of ordinary days. Harold watched the way she crossed her arms, not defensive, but as if bracing herself to hold whatever truth she would soon be asked to receive, and felt a fierce gratitude for the partner who had chosen this life with him. Their greeting was spare and intimate, hands to face, the ritual inspection that had always cut through surface answers to whatever lay below. Together, they moved through their living room into the kitchen, photos and family history artifacts lining the walls like quiet witnesses to the conversation to come. At the kitchen table, with coffee steaming between them, Harold began to tell the story he had barely survived that day. Cross's dismissal, the interview that slid from neutral to contemptuous, and the final humiliating pronouncement that his medals were worthless. Sarah listened with the hard focus of someone who had spent decades learning to pass not just events, but the emotional truths they implied. As Harold described the swelling crisis, the lobby confrontation, the sudden arrival of General Thorne, the rapid escalation that culminated in Cross cancelling a $38 million contract, Sarah's memory supplied the missing faces and ranks with surgical clarity. She remembered the captain from Helmand, the young soldier Harold and Martinez had pulled from a burning vehicle, and the recollection folded the present moment back into a past only they fully understood. Her reaction was layered: anger at the insult, relief at Thorne's intervention, and a deeper, weary recognition that the world no longer automatically honored what their generation had lived through. Harold watched her process all of that, and felt simultaneously exposed and steadied by the way she held his hand across the table in quiet, uncompromising solidarity. They examined the business card Thorne had left, embossed, authoritative, a small square of paper carrying outsized possibility, and debated what to do next with the weary pragmatism that had sustained them through other crises. Sarah asked the simple practical questions Harold had been avoiding. When would he call? What would he say? And how would they cope if the gesture proved to be only gratitude with no follow-through? Harold pledged to call the next morning, speaking the commitment aloud, because naming the action made it less optional and less easy to tuck away behind anxious hesitation. Both of them acknowledged the deeper stakes beneath the surface: dwindling savings, The fact that a military pension would no longer be sufficient, and the humbling negotiations of dignity that came with seeking paid work in civilian spaces that frequently failed to value military experience. Sarah's response was not sentimental counsel, but concrete support. If nothing came from Thorne's overture, they would find another way forward together, as they had done for 31 years. That night and into the next morning, Harold woke with the specific clarity of someone whose mind had been cleared by honest, painful conversation, and he prepared as if for a mission whose parameters were newly visible. He moved through his routine with the crisp rituals he'd been given by decades in uniform: precise shower temperature, methodical shaving, clothing selected for purpose rather than show. Sarah moved through her own household tasks with matching exactness, an unspoken choreography of mutual steadying that made their kitchen feel less like a home and more like a command post where decisions were placed into motion. Harold set a time, 8:30, for the call, giving himself minutes to gather purpose without allowing doubt to metastasize. When the phone connected and Captain Williams verified the appointment, the formalities were brief and the bridge to Thorne swift. The general's voice dropped across the line like weather, familiar and commanding, and the conversation shifted rapidly from courtesy to offer. Thorne did not linger on yesterday's drama. He framed it as necessary and then moved decisively to purpose. He described a position that matched Harold's skill set almost too precisely. Senior liaison overseeing NATO logistics coordination across a constellation of bases, countries, contractors, and cultural ruptures. The work was described in unvarnished terms: administrative, diplomatic, detail-heavy, essential more for function than for glamour, and with compensation that would materially change the Freeman's precarious arithmetic. Thorne was blunt about the travel commitment, the 6 months abroad, the long stretches away from home, the per diems and housing allowances that would buffer their finances. More than money, he offered relevancy, an institutional need that recognized competence rather than dismissing it, a role in which Harold's long-formed habits of system thinking and crisis management would be assets rather than anomalies. Harold's internal calculations were immediate and humane. He measured the offer against the cost to his marriage's daily life, against the memory of friends who never returned, and the quiet of grandchildren's swings in their backyard. Sarah, in turn, assessed risk with the same pragmatic courage she had always used to translate battlefield absences into household strategies. This was not a combat deployment, she reminded him. It was logistics and coordination, with reliable communications and predictable routes back to each other. Her refusal to romanticize the decision centered not on denying fear, but on naming what they had already lived through and thereby reducing the scale of the unknown. Harold admitted that he wanted to accept, but confessed his fear of mistaking relief for judgment. Sarah cut through his doubt, insisting that Thorne's selection was not pity but judgment. He needed a competent steward and had chosen someone he trusted implicitly. Their exchange at the kitchen table that morning turned the offer into an axis around which their future tilted, and Harold made his choice. He would accept the position. Saying it aloud rendered it less negotiable and more an act of faith between them. Sarah's embrace afterward was both celebration and vow. She would manage the household rhythms while he stepped into a public role that offered both financial repair and professional redemption. There was a solemnity to the small domestic rituals that followed: packing, a purchased suit that Sarah insisted on, a leather portfolio chosen for its gravity, as if each material item was a talisman warding off the old indignities and marking the threshold into institutional recognition. The decision did not erase the pain of the Nexus encounter, but it reframed it, converting humiliation into a vector that had propelled Harold back toward meaningful work. In that reframing, the couple found a renewed sense of agency. 3 weeks later, Harold walked into a different downtown building, an edifice of federal architecture that promised permanence rather than ephemeral innovation. Security and bureaucracy received him with the efficiency he expected and the credentials he had been promised. An official portfolio and a seal that made his role visible in a way no civilian interview ever had. The Corps of Engineers offices smelled of floor polish and institutional coffee, details that unlocked decades of memory and made him feel less adrift. Captain Williams met him with a firm handshake and a tone of welcome that suggested Thorne had already orchestrated the social infrastructure he would need for a successful re-entry. The workspace he was shown was modest but functional, designated and equipped in ways that mattered to someone who measured worth by the capacity to perform rather than by public accolades. Harold's new credentials felt like a small, decisive redress, a leather card and a badge that converted private sacrifice into public trust. The monitors in his office displayed tracking systems and logistics feeds that translated mission complexity into comprehensible data streams. And for the first time in many months, Harold felt the old muscles of professional competence awaken. The briefs stacked on his desk were substantial, not curated simplifications meant to fast-track comprehension, but comprehensive packets that suited his appetite for full context. Captain Williams' remark that Thorne preferred to give him complete material rather than digestible summaries reinforced the sense that Thorne remembered how Harold worked best, with complexity in hand, not with comforting simplifications. There was a quiet dignity in being prepared in the exact form that matched his strengths. General Thorne arrived as if pulled from the same fabric of history that bound him and Harold together, immediate, unceremonious and present in the doorway before Harold had fully absorbed his new surroundings. The two men faced one another with the long residue of shared experience between them, a history that included trauma, survival, and debts repaid in ways that never fully erased what had been taken. Thorne's figure in the doorway was a pivot, the moment when personal obligation met institutional power and the private past intersected with a bureaucratic present. Harold felt that odd convergence acutely, gratitude for a life-saving past, trepidation at renewed exposure to military hierarchies, and a cautious hope that this role might allow him to translate sacrifice into service again. The scene recalled the old camaraderie without illusion. It acknowledged debts and responsibilities while opening a channel through which both men could act on them. What followed? The first exchanges, the practical onboarding, the manner in which Thorne introduced Harold to his temporary staff confirmed the promise that had been made over the phone. Thorne moved from gratitude to administration, aligning personnel and resources so Harold could step into the role with support rather than solitary expectation. The transition was not theatrical. It was procedural, deliberate, and quietly kind in the way it rearranged institutional attention towards someone who had been sidelined by a private sector prejudice only days earlier. This steadied Harold in ways the earlier vindication at Nexus could not, because it translated moral recognition into functional responsibility and payment into purpose. The synthesis of those elements, trust, task, compensation, began to repair a private ledger that had been accumulating losses and slights. Throughout, Sarah's presence remained the axis around which Harold's renewed life spun. Even when absent physically for months, the decisions they made together shaped how he would approach the work. Their conversation at the kitchen table, the mutual exchange of fear and resolve, became the template for a partnership that could absorb longer absences because it had refined mechanisms for endurance over 3 decades. Harold's acceptance was as much an act of faith in their shared strategies as it was in Thorne's offer. The practicalities, housing allowances, travel per diem, secure communications, mattered, But they mattered because they enabled the human continuity that both feared losing: birthdays, small repairs, the rhythms of grandchildren's visits. The chapters close on a convergence of reckonings. Harold's dignity challenged and then validated. Sarah's unglamorous steadfastness acknowledged as essential, and an institutional actor, stepping back into a life he feared had no place for him. The narrative refrains from tidy triumph. It never promises a cure for the broader societal failure to honor service. But it does record a personal re-entry into meaning. The offer from Thorne is both repayment and instrument, an attempt to convert gratitude into sustained consequential work that uses the very competencies the civilian world had dismissed. Harold's choice to accept is therefore both pragmatic and moral. It affirms personal worth through service rather than through comfort or retirement. In the final image the text gives us, Harold stands in a modest office, surrounded by evidence that the world still has use for the skills he honed under fire, and General Thorne's presence at his door makes the point tangible. That doorway, both literal and figurative, marks a threshold he and Sarah crossed together. The indignity of dismissal behind them, the uncertainty of long separations ahead, and a renewed capacity to matter in institutions that still require people who can hold complexity. The ending is not an end to struggle, but a reconfiguration of it. From private humiliation to institutional responsibility, from stalled identity to assigned purpose. Harold's trajectory has shifted. The story closes on the hard, steady light of a new assignment, an imperfect but real reclamation of value, and a forward motion that both honors the past and insists on relevance in the present.